story out of CBS for a special on 60 Minutes Sports. Armin Katayan interviewing two attorneys for the state. Frank Fina, the Chief Deputy Attorney General for Pennsylvania, and Joseph McGettigan III, who was actually the lead prosecutor in the case against Jerry Sandusky, where he was found guilty on over 44 or 47 counts. They still believe that there were efforts to cover up the abuse at Penn State. They are convinced of that. They are fully persuaded that Graham Spanier, Gary Schultz, Tim Curley, all were a part of an attempt to cover up and to protect Penn State University, the brand, and were willing to do whatever it took to accomplish that. But what's interesting to note, and I think needs to be said loud and clear, is that to a direct question about the level of involvement that Coach Paterno had, they said he had none, that the evidence does not point to that at all. With us tonight to talk about that is a return guest to the show, John Ziegler from FramingPaterno.com. He's joining us on the 84 Lumber Project Professionals Newsline. Mr. Ziegler, welcome to KDK. Good to have you back on.
Robert, always good to talk to you, and this is a particularly interesting evening to be discussing this because this Armin Katayan report is one of the most extraordinary things I've ever seen, and I've dedicated most of my professional life to documenting media malpractice, as I like to call it. One of my documentary films was called Media Malpractice after the 2008 election, and this was about as bad a case of media malpractice as I have ever seen in my life. I thought I had lost the ability to be shocked by the media coverage of this case, but this is really something what happened tonight, so I hope we can get into the details on it.
Oh, I tell you what, let's do that now. Before we go on to the issue of specifically talking about Joe Paterno and the question and response, why are you suggesting, or if not clearly saying, that there's an example of media malpractice in this CBS 60 Minutes Sports piece that was done?
Wow. I'm not sure you have enough time, but I'll give you the short answer. First of all, let's go right into the Paterno thing, because I think the Paterno thing is a great example of the media malpractice, and there are many other examples which I hope we'll get to as well.
Okay.
But the headline of this story, as you very correctly and succinctly pointed out, it needs to be repeated, that Fina said, when asked a direct question, was Joe Paterno part of a cover-up? He said, I do not believe so, and I found no evidence to show that.
I tell you what, in fact, instead of just taking your word for it and my word for it, how about if we played that portion of the interview? Here it is.
Do you believe that Coach Paterno was a part of the conspiracy to conceal, to cover up the crimes at Penn State by Jerry Sandusky?
I do not, and I'm viewing this strictly on the evidence, not any kind of fealty to anybody. I did not find that evidence.
Now, that's extraordinary, Robert, and ought to be the headline everywhere. And frankly, there was nothing else in this report. Now, this was a teaser report for a 60 Minutes on Showtime deal that's going to happen tomorrow night. But nothing in the 3.5 minutes that CBS gave on the air tonight was new information, except that. Now, anybody who knows anything about journalism or reporting or news knows that's the lead. That's the only thing that people will be interested in. That's the only piece of new information. That's the only thing of substance and that's important that came out of this interview. Armin Katayan didn't even mention that when he tweeted the story, which I'm going to get to because I had a confrontation with Armin on Twitter just about 20 minutes ago, which is fascinating. He didn't even mention that. In the article that's on CBS's website, it's not mentioned in the headline. Interestingly, it is mentioned on the homepage. And CBS, in its lead-in, Scott Pelley, while he mentions Joe Paterno, basically tries to downplay, doesn't even mention that there's this bombshell that Fina, the prosecutor, is saying, look, Joe Paterno was not involved with this. And by the way, that's an incredibly remarkable statement, not just because no one's ever said that from the prosecution standpoint before publicly, although they have said it. People have to remember, and it's in the very beginning of my documentary film, The Framing of Joe Paterno, which framing is figurative, not literal, not a conspiracy guy.
Yes.
Sarah Gannon's first article on this story, and she won the Pulitzer Prize, which I don't think she deserved, was Joe Paterno praised for acting appropriately with regard to Jerry Sandusky's sex abuse suspicions.
That's right.
That was the day the story broke.
Right.
And that was from a Office of the Attorney General source to Gannon. Now, this is a big deal because now publicly we have someone saying this, and it's against their own self-interest to say this, but they said it because it's the truth. And CBS buried the lead, and then worse than burying the lead, Robert, did you hear Armen Keteyian's response?
Yes.
What Fina said?
I don't have the audio in a package for me, but I do have the text in front of me. In response to that exchange between Keteyian and Fina, Keteyian then said, "But you know as well as I do, Frank, Joe Paterno was the most powerful man on that campus, arguably the most powerful coach in college football. He knew what was going on in that university, and the argument is if he knew what he knew, he should have put a stop to it. He should have done more." Fina's response to that, "Well, that's right, and I don't see any need to judge him beyond his own words. He said it best. I didn't do enough. I should have done more."
Now, that's extraordinary, and then that's exactly what was said, and that's a direct quote, but that's an extraordinary exchange. First of all, Keteyian doesn't come back with a fact or two that shows that Paterno knew. He comes back with, well, come on, I just feel like Paterno had to have known because everybody knew he was all-powerful. By the way, I spoke on the phone with Dottie Sandusky today for about an hour. Dottie Sandusky, who has lived with Jerry, obviously, almost all of his adult life,
Yes.
and now knows that Jerry is convicted of 45 counts of child molestation and has gone through more hell than anybody I could possibly imagine, still to this day believes Jerry is 100% innocent. And not because she's delusional, because she really believes that. How in the world Joe Paterno was supposed to know simply because he was somewhat in the sphere of his life, not a guy who was close to him. They hated each other. That was clear when I interviewed Jerry Sandusky in prison. Sandusky has disdain for Paterno. They were not social friends. Sandusky had been an ex-coach for many years when this story hit. The reality is that Keteyian is just spouting off his feelings that are not based on any fact. And then he allows Fina to misquote Joe Paterno's statement. Joe Paterno never said, "I didn't do enough." He never said that. He said, with the benefit of hindsight, which is not part of that exchange, but it's critical to understanding what Joe Paterno said in a written statement just before his firing. Mm-hmm. He said, with the benefit of hindsight, I wish I had done more. That is extremely different than I didn't do enough. But here Keteyian is actively and on nothing but emotion trying to contradict Fina, who against his own self-interest is saying, nope, we found no evidence that Joe Paterno was involved in a cover-up. And then Fina, because I guess he's afraid of being, seen as a Joe bot or something, and he's going to be criticized as defending Joe Paterno. We know you can't do that in the media. So he scrambles to say, well, his own words say that. Well, if you're going to say somebody, if you're going to use someone's own words and act like you're quoting them, get the words right. And those aren't Joe Paterno's words.
That's a fair statement to make. And if you're going to talk to prosecutors and get their thoughts on this, then especially with something as important as this is, they didn't prosecute Jerry Sandusky on feelings. They presented evidence. In courts, attorneys present evidence. If you have evidence that Joe knew, then cite the evidence that shows that Joe knew, that obviously everyone has to know. There's disclosure in court proceedings. You can't just drop the bomb on somebody, as it were. So present the evidence that you have that Joe Paterno clearly knew, And I agree with you. There isn't that evidence. Nobody's presented that evidence if it does exist. And the idea of this insistence of wanting to still make Joe Paterno look as bad as they can is absolutely beyond me. Do me a favor. Hold on right there. I got to pause for a moment. We'll come back with more. Does it matter to you that when Attorney Frank Fina is asked about Joe Paterno, was he a part of a conspiracy to conceal, to cover up crimes at Penn State by Jerry Sandusky? And Fina's response, does not believe that, and he didn't find any evidence of that. Does that matter to you? Matters to me. Young man, Gino, good to have you here. CBS News now reporting for their special feature, CBS Sports 60 Minutes. CBS 60 Minutes Sports, rather. Armin Katayan asking one of the attorneys involved in prosecuting Jerry Sandusky, the attorney Frank Fina, asked if he believed that Coach Paterno was part of the conspiracy to conceal, to cover up the crimes at Penn State. And he said, I do not. I'm viewing this strictly on the evidence. I did not find that evidence. Wow. But on my Facebook page, I see a comment here regarding this issue, and there are some that don't care about evidence. The evidence just doesn't matter to them. They want to hate Joe Paterno, and that's enough. One comment here. As an alum, I was disgusted by Paterno, still am. Even though he claimed to have done what he was required to do, a leader does more. He put it in the hands of the administration, who did nothing. And what? He never went back? He had so much power at Penn State University that he could have went into the administration and said, you do something or else. Then he would have been a hero. John Ziegler with us from FramingPaterno.com. What do you think to that comment?
Well, I understand the logic because people have been given misinformation. See, they think that it was obvious that everybody knew that Jerry Sandusky was a pedophile. But that's where the logic breaks down here, Robert, because Joe Paterno didn't know, because none of them knew, because the evidence was not nearly as overwhelming to them then as it appears to us now. And I have dedicated over a year of my life, done a documentary film, done a free book called The Betrayal of Joe Paterno. People can see it all for free at FramingPaterno.com. It's all there. The reality is, the evidence, when you look at the evidence, is that nobody, quote-unquote, knew, which is why I use the example of Dottie still not knowing today. Now, you mentioned Armin Katayan.
Yes.
Now, let's talk a little bit about the Penn State administrators and what they knew. Katayan in his report says, it took a while for prosecutors to realize that the three administrators who are now on trial were putting the school's brand above repeated sexual abuse on its campus. Now, that's extraordinary on a number of levels. First of all, this notion that somehow the Penn State brand was at stake here is absurd. Jerry Sandusky was a former assistant coach when they were presented with Mike McQueary's allegations, whatever it was that he told them in 2001. That was 2 years plus after he had left the program. In no way, shape, or form would Penn State have been held responsible. They would have been held up as heroes for putting a pedophile, if that's what he was proven to be, behind bars. This notion that somehow their brand, or they had any motive to protect their brand, is ludicrous. No one liked him. No one was close to him. There was nothing to salvage or protect here. And then this notion, and this is what I asked Katayan about on Twitter. He said, repeated sexual abuse on its campus. There is not one shred of evidence, not one shred of evidence that Penn State as an institution was informed of repeated sexual abuse. This is what's happened, though. I believe Katayan doesn't understand the story, because it's in my documentary where Katayan says in November of 2011 that Penn State officials were informed of abuse on campus in 2000 and 2002 and did nothing. That's not a factual statement. In fact, that is a a completely incorrect statement. I think Katayan mistakenly believes that the infamous janitor episode was reported to Penn State, because that's what allegedly happened in 2000, although there's huge problems with the date and other aspects of that particular case. There is not one allegation, Robert, that the janitor episode was ever reported to anybody at Penn State.
Well, the argument was that the janitors were so concerned about their ability to clean the commodes at Happy Valley that they kept it quiet.
Well, again, I'd love to get into the janitor episode because there's a whole series of problems. What I'm saying is I think Katayan doesn't understand the basic facts of the case.
Fair enough.
Not to mention that he got the year wrong, as did Mike McQueary and the prosecution. It was not 2002. It was 2001, which I think is one of the most critical facts in this entire case, because I don't know how Mike McQueary sees what he now says he saw and forgets not just the date, the month, and the year, but also, by the way, and I think a lot of your listeners might appreciate this way of looking at it, mistakenly thinks it happened after 9/11 as opposed to before 9/11. Because I don't know about you, but that was a life marker for me and for most people at that time. So how you can make that work is beyond me.
Yes.
So I asked Katayan on Twitter, could you please explain to me where the repeated episodes of sexual abuse that Penn State was informed of came from? That was basically my question. This was his response. This is his tweet back to me, which still exists.
Okay.
To you and your small army of foul-mouthed PSU supporters, by the way, I didn't go to Penn State, I went to Georgetown. There is no reasoning with you with facts or otherwise, over and out. So he doesn't answer the question, which he can't, because he's flat out wrong on it. And he decides that because, I guess, this has exploded on Twitter. I mean, I've never seen so many tweets about this on anything I've been involved with. People are outraged at this report. They're outraged at his reaction to it, not willing to answer simple questions. You make a statement like that on CBS News, and you're not willing to back it up. And then he lets FINA say, we came to realize that they, meaning the three who were on trial, were actively obstructing our investigation. And then he says, you mean they were obstructing justice? And FINA says, yes, and they had been for many years. Now, first of all, I've talked to someone close to this case who believes that may be a violation of standards and ethics by FINA to say that with the three facing trial. And his next statement about, I hope that justice will be served was also completely inappropriate. But the notion that they were actively obstructing the investigation, you mean when the three of them, Curley, Spanier, and Schultz, decided to voluntarily testify at a grand jury without their own attorneys? You mean that was when they were actively obstructing the investigation? Seriously? Come on, Robert. I mean, this is ridiculous. Anybody who knows anything about this case knows that just doesn't pass the smell test. That's not what happened here. And yet Armin Katayan doesn't know enough to even confront FINA on this and lets him spin this web of distortion.
You made a couple of comments earlier. One of them, can you stick around past the news headlines?
Yes, let's do it.
Okay, because you talked about the interview that you had with Jerry Sandusky, where you talked of the disdain that was had from Jerry Sandusky back to Paterno. There are many people, countless people that I've encountered on this show and otherwise, that believe that Joe Paterno and Jerry Sandusky were joined at the hip, that they were bosom buddies, that they were friends until the very, very end and had a close bond together, and he was willing to do anything for his friend Jerry Sandusky, and Jerry Sandusky was a devoted follower of Joe Paterno, and you're using the word disdain. I want to go over that coming up just moments away. Yes. All right, we're talking about an interview that was done for CBS and their special on CBS 60 Minutes Sports. Armin Katayan interviewing two attorneys for the state of Pennsylvania, Frank FINA, the Chief Deputy Attorney General for Pennsylvania, and the lead prosecutor in the case against Jerry Sandusky, Joseph McGettigan III. The quote that I think is the most notable in all of this is Katayan asking FINA if Coach Paterno was a part of the conspiracy to conceal, to cover up the crimes at Penn State by Jerry Sandusky, and FINA's response, simple, I do not. I did not find that evidence. It really comes down to just that. But that's not the lead. That's not the focal point of the story. Why isn't it? And why is it that there's this great desire by some to want to do all that they can to, piss on the grave of Joe Paterno because it's not good enough that he's already dead. That the idea that anything that would be said that would clear his name needs to be set aside, ignored. I'm surprised they even bothered to include this in the piece, to be honest with you. With us to talk about this is John Ziegler. He is the author of FramingPaterno.com. You can go to his website and get all kinds of information regarding this issue. We were talking before the news headlines in the last half hour about the disdain that you claim that Jerry Sandusky has toward Joe Paterno. So many people are convinced that they were close. Help us better understand that there was this animosity between the two.
Well, this was something that took me by surprise. There were several things that took me by surprise when I visited with Sandusky in prison for over 3 hours and then spoke to him on the phone for another half hour. And I've gotten over a dozen letters from him, including one that we just released to the public last week because it bashed Penn State for the nature of the settlements in the case. And one of the things that really stunned me, Robert, was the palpable disdain that Jerry Sandusky still has to Joe Paterno. Now, you would think, right, even if you hated somebody in your life, if because of your actions you had destroyed their entire life's work and legacy, right, as Sandusky clearly did with Paterno, you would think that you would have at least some sympathy, some concern, some willingness to make amends, right?
Right.
I sensed none of that. And I tried. In fact, I was so stunned by this, I inquired further, and it was clear. It couldn't have been more obvious. In fact, before I even was able to tell anyone of the details of the interview, Scott Paterno called me, and Scott and I do not get along, as people probably who followed this know. And Scott, one of the first things Scott said to me was, "So you found out Jerry and my father didn't like each other, right?" And that's exactly what I said. Yep. I mean, it was unbelievable. And I actually sensed it was mostly out of narcissism and jealousy on Jerry's part, that Jerry felt as if he should have been the person who got all the credit because he was the one that ran the defense. He should have gotten credit for the 1986 national championship. And by the way, here's the ultimate proof. You don't need to take my word for it or Scott Paterno's word that Jerry and Joe didn't like each other. How come, Robert, whenever there's a story about the two of them, there's only one photograph that ever gets used? Do you notice that? It's a photograph from, I believe, the mid-'90s, where Joe is standing behind Jerry. Jerry's got his goofy grin, and Joe kind of has his hand on his shoulder.
Okay.
That's the only one photo that they ever use. Joe Paterno he barely even attended Jerry Sandusky's retirement party or whatever you want to call it. He gave a very short statement and was gone.
So this tension goes back long before the retirement of Sandusky. Because some people would say, well, I can understand that because Jerry wanted to be the head coach and Paterno wasn't going to retire. And once Jerry realized that may have been the time when they stopped liking each other. But before that, then they were close.
Well, I don't know. I wasn't involved in the relationship at that time. I do know that Jerry feels as if, from a football perspective, that he deserved the credit here. He believes that there was a lot of jealousy towards him. He believes that he actually believes, Jerry does, I don't share this belief, but Jerry told me he believes that Tom Bradley, who was the defensive coordinator after him, was so jealous of his legacy that Bradley was very close to Mike McQueary, and that played a role in how McQueary viewed Sandusky. I don't believe that, but I'm just telling you that in coaching, there's huge egos, there's jealousies, and the notion, of all the absurdities in this entire case, Robert, the most ridiculous thing, and that's really saying something, is probably the idea that Paterno and Sandusky were close. There's no evidence of that whatsoever, and there was no incentive whatsoever for Joe Paterno to cover up for Jerry Sandusky, an ex-assistant he didn't like. Okay, right. That's the reality of it, and there's no evidence to support it, as Fina admitted, and then Armand Katayan, in one of the most outrageous things I've seen in a long time, fights him on it, and then Fina misquotes Joe Paterno's words. You can't make this up. the media on this case is the worst. I thought it was horrendous when I did media malpractice on the 2008 election of
Yes.
Obama and Palin. That was a different league, and we've seen it with George Zimmerman. But in this case, my God. I mean, there's just no objectivity. Facts don't matter. No one ever wants to answer a question. You confront the guy on Twitter, and he gives you the response that I told you he gave me tonight.
Right.
Katayan did. It was embarrassing, and it
Yes.
really exposes that they have no facts.
Right.
They
The presumption
have no facts.
is that this is the case. You would otherwise have to prove that he didn't know, because everybody just presumes that he had to have known. Where's your evidence that shows that he didn't?
And you're exactly right. The burden of proof was flipped forever in this case on November 9, 2011, when Joe Paterno was fired, Graham Spanier was essentially fired, and Penn State was perceived as having issued a guilty plea in this case. That forever and forever more, I believe, I call it the original sin of this case, that changed the burden of proof for everybody. By the way, including Sandusky, because I think his trial was a sham in a lot of ways.
Let me ask, do you think that if Joe Paterno would have never made the comment about, in hindsight, would have done more, that people's attitudes wouldn't have been so contrary to him, that when he said that then opened up this idea that he had to have known then, and that's a guilty conscience speaking?
Well, it's funny you say that. I have been very critical, which is why Scott Paterno and I did not get along, because Scott's been running the Paterno family PR on this since day one. I've been very critical of the way they've handled everything. Obviously, the media was going to take anything they said completely out of context. Very easily, Robert, in a sane media world, that statement by Joe Paterno should have been praised. Oh, my gosh. Someone is actually taking some responsibility here. No one, to this day, Robert, Joe Paterno is the only person to take any responsibility for any of this mess. And yet the evidence indicates he probably doesn't deserve any of that responsibility. And yet when he takes a small portion of it with a rational statement, they omit the hindsight part, they manipulate the should have done more. Fina misquotes him on CBS tonight, and Armin Katayan allows the piece to end without correcting him. People they believe what they want to believe, and they misinterpreted that statement to conform to the beliefs they wanted to have. And so I'm not sure anything could have been done to save it, but that was clearly a mistake from a PR standpoint.
And with all the way that people view Paterno, and should I, because I think you make a fantastic point about him taking on, wishing he would have done more. On the flip side of that, you have Coach McQuarrie, who handled the whole thing horribly from the moment he saw it all the way through. If he did see what he ultimately claims that he saw, that no one can come forward and say, yes, he told me about this way back then. Nobody's willing to crush him over this. How could a man see what he claims to have seen and do nothing more than close a locker? How could this man who claims to have seen what he did and then be satisfied with what ultimately would have been an absolutely bogus conclusion by Spanier, Curley, and Schultz if you really saw what you saw? And how do you stay at that program? How do you continue coaching under Paterno? How do you the whole thing is unbelievable. You don't talk about going through a process of rationalizing something out and thinking something through.
Well, Robert, let's look at it logically. See, I think you make an outstanding point, but I go in the other direction of where that leads us. I think that means that he didn't see what he now currently
exactly
saw. Because it doesn't make any damn sense.
Right.
Because any human being would have stopped it. One of the more amazing things Mike McQuarrie said in one of his many versions of this story is he was asked, why did he not identify the boy? Why did he not do anything to stop what was going on? Why did he leave Sandusky and what he thought mistakenly was a 10-year-old boy, it was actually almost a 14-year-old boy, in a shower alone? You know what his answer was? His answer was, because I thought the situation was done. What? You thought you had broken the mood? And that Sandusky was just going to go, if he really was doing what you said he was doing, he was just going to stop and go home now?
Right.
I mean, not only that, but I am convinced, because Jerry and the victim, whose statement is at our website, framingpaterno.com, the guy who just took money from Penn State, but who I believe will say when he does his interview, inevitably, that he was not abused in the shower that night. Both of them, in very convincing ways, say that McQueary never even made his presence known. They didn't know Mike McQueary was the witness, Robert. That means that all he really did do was slam that locker. Now, that makes no sense. And by the way, it also makes no sense. He also played in, and I believe it's going to be proven, I've been told by numerous people, it's going to be proven, he played in 2 Jerry Sandusky-sponsored golf tournaments after this. He joked around with Jerry Sandusky at an Easter Seals charity football game. He asked Jerry Sandusky about a walk-on from Central Mountain High School.
Right.
And then in 2010, Jerry says the relationship dramatically changed. Jerry didn't know Mike was the witness. That's important. And why did it change in 2010? Because McQueary was confronted by investigators who told him, we've got other victims, we need help, we need a witness, we heard you saw something, what did you see? Mike McQueary did what was a natural thing. He looked back 10 years ago and he goes, oh my God, I've always wondered what I saw, and now I realize what I saw was horrendous. And that's what I think happened here. And by the way, I think investigators twisted his arm in order to get him to go, to turn that 1-alarm fire that he saw in 2001 into a 5-alarm fire in 2011. That's the only way to make this thing make sense logically. And that, to me, tells a very different story about what really happened here and how it was that Penn State did not know and Joe Paterno did not know that Jerry Sandusky was a pedophile. And now finally we have one of the lead attorneys for the state saying that Joe Paterno had no knowledge of this and was not involved in the cover-up. And CBS decides to bury their own lead and try to mitigate it, go out of their way to mitigate it, all out of extraordinary, extreme bias, and it's outrageous, and people need to understand what's really going on here, because the whole thing stinks to high heaven.
I want to get your thoughts on one more issue. News out in the last 24 hours or so about Penn State and this settlement, and now they made this settlement without the agreement of the insurance companies. Yeah. Apparently, they were completely out of the loop on this. Penn State just made the settlement, and now they want to go back to the insurance companies to collect the money. The insurance companies are saying, oh, these policies don't cover this. We're not paying. I know you heard about it. I want to get your thoughts about it coming up. We'll talk more. 866-391-1020, Dollar Bank Instant Access at KDKA.com. All right, we are speaking tonight with John Ziegler, FramingPaterno.com. We're talking primarily about the story from CBS News, where Frank Fina, the Chief Deputy Attorney General for Pennsylvania, being interviewed by Armen Keteyian, where Armen Keteyian asked a very direct question about the issue of Joe Paterno. Do you believe that Coach Paterno was a part of the conspiracy to conceal, to cover up the crimes at Penn State by Jerry Sandusky? Fina saying, I do not. And I am viewing this strictly on the evidence, not any kind of fealty to anybody. I did not find that evidence. Now, they are overwhelmingly convinced that there's all this evidence, and I'm waiting to see it as well as John, regarding Sandusky and Curley. I'm sorry, regarding Curley to Schultz and to Spanier about their guilt in covering this up, because they are convinced of that, but they are not convinced that there's any guilt at all when it comes to Paterno in this particular case. But now we have Penn State announcing their settlements, tens of millions of dollars. And now they want the insurance companies to pay up. And apparently they've made these settlements without any legal counsel from the insurance companies to negotiate these settlements. Normally, you do something wrong, and then there's a payment that is made out. The insurance company gets an attorney and then defends itself because it wants to avoid paying out any more than it has to, and then represents you in the process. That's not the case with Penn State. They now made the settlements and then are now wanting the insurance companies to pay. This whole thing seems so convoluted.
Well, that's for damn sure.
Yes, I mean,
one other quick point on the Paterno thing before I answer your question about the settlements. I believe that the reason Fina has said, I've looked at the evidence and I don't find it that Paterno was involved in the cover-up, is because of an interview that Joe Paterno did with his office with one of his investigators, which I revealed on my website about a month and a half ago, which people can see in chapter number 2 of my book. It's free. I don't make any money from this, called The Betrayal of Joe Paterno. It's an extraordinary interview that the media has never really covered, and it makes it very clear when you read what Paterno says. This was 2 weeks before he was fired, that he was obviously out of the loop on this entire situation after he passed on what McQueary told him to Tim Curley. So people can see that for themselves at framingpaterno.com. As far as the settlements, I have been so outraged by this entire situation, and here's the different levels of outrage. First of all, Penn State is not culpable for any of these victims. There's only 2 of these victims they even theoretically knew about. One, the situation in 1998 was found to be unfounded. Number 2, the situation in 2001, victim number 2 has said on the record as an adult numerous times that nothing happened. So what Penn State is doing, paying to begin with, is ridiculous. Now, the way they've done this, I believe, Robert, and I'm, as you can tell, I'm emphatic when I know something for sure. This is something I don't know for sure. I'm theorizing here.
Okay.
But it seems to me as if you do the logic and the math here, what happened was that Penn State knew that it would be a tough sell to their board of trustees members, especially the new ones that were elected on a pro-Paterno platform, in order to get them to absorb this and to agree to this. I think they snowed them. And I think they gave, because I've talked to members of the board of trustees about this, and they were convinced that doing this was going to save the university money in the long run, which to me shouldn't have mattered at all, because no one cares about money in this case, and it's not their damn money. It's other people's money. But I believe that Penn State has purposely snowed those people into going ahead and agreeing to this based upon this notion of fiscal responsibility. And it doesn't surprise me at all that was a bogus argument, and that in fact Penn State is going to be on the hook for the whole $60 million when they aren't responsible for any of it. And I think the most nefarious part of this, Robert, is the evidence is clear. The evidence is clear, and FINA showed it tonight as well. This is I'm not a conspiracy guy at all, but I believe we are now in a post-story essential framing or conspiracy here to convict Spanier, Curley, and Schultz. And that's why FINA made his comments today. That's why he did this interview, which was inappropriate to begin with. And that's why Penn State is settling in the way that they are. They have made this the biggest story, the longest-lasting story possible. They have gone out of their way to disclose information that was damaging to Spanier, Curley, and Schultz's trial, information that I have proven at our website is false. For instance, the date of victim number 5 was not after the McQueary episode, but Penn State paid extra money for that because they want Spanier, Curley, and Schultz convicted, because the people in charge then will not have to be facing the wrath of their alumni base, who will say, wait a minute, what did we do all this for when we weren't guilty? So they have a perverse, inverted self-interest to be found guilty. And it's bizarre. I understand why people can't understand it, but it's the truth as best I can tell.
But what about the argument? We talked about this before, but if you wait until you get guilty verdicts, don't you run the risk of having the dollar amounts ultimately be even more?
Theoretically possible, Robert, but when people understand what the actual allegations are here, see, that's the other part. No one wants to investigate this like I have. It's a nasty story. But when you actually investigate what most of these allegations are,
yes,
no one's going to get multi-million dollars for being thrown in a pool. Nobody's going to
hold on. The issue of... Here's what I'm concerned about, and I want to get your thought. I only have a couple of minutes here. Do you think that there's going to be sufficient evidence to convict Curley, Schultz, and Spanier of any of the crimes relating back to this case?
I do not believe there's any evidence. However, I am incredibly concerned that because of the way the settlements have gone down, and because of things like, FINA basically did an advertisement on CBS tonight for the conviction of Spanier, Curley, and Schultz. That was outrageous what he did, polluting the jury pool like that, and I believe it was an ethical violation. So I am very concerned that the jury is not going to come back with a proper verdict. I have put $10,000 on the table for charity to any media member who will take it. No one will, because they know I'm right, that they will not be convicted convicted on the perjury charges, because legally and logically, there's absolutely no way you can make any sense of those perjury charges. But I am very concerned that the jury, and by the way, there's been incredible polling done on this in Dauphin County, where this trial will take place, that shows the jury pool is already unbelievably polluted. So I don't know how they get a fair trial, Robert. I really don't. And I think it's going to be a real shame. And I think there are very powerful forces that want to see a guilty verdict in this case.
Do you think
a gross miscarriage of injustice?
What about the issue that Penn State does not want to be viewed as though they're defending Sandusky? Because I have to say this. When you were on with me last time, and I know you were on with PenTech a couple of days ago, last week,
right?
It is easy, I believe, for people to hear you and think that you are defending Jerry Sandusky.
I understand that, and I get it, and it's not the case. But here, and I think it's the biggest PR mistake that Penn State and the Paterno forces have made. In order to understand this story, you need to put the crimes of Jerry Sandusky in context. And unfortunately, this caricature has been created, which has now lost any sense of rationality, any sense of evidence or the facts. And because of that, that's why people think it's impossible that Joe Paterno didn't know, because they think Jerry Sandusky was at the 50-yard line on Saturday afternoons having sex with boys. That's not what was happening here.
Right.
And so I'm about the truth and the facts, Robert. I don't care that people misinterpret me. It's their own damn fault. Find out what really happened at framingpaterno.com, and I appreciate you actually having the guts to hear a side of the story that doesn't often get played, because it really is the truth, and it's an incredibly important story.
John Ziegler, great having you on this evening. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Robert.
Always great talking to you. John Ziegler once again. Now.